She was just 8 months old. A mother kissed her daughter goodbye, unaware it would be the last time she'd see her alive. Hours later, the baby was rushed to the hospital, covered in injuries no child should ever endure. What really happened in that house? Imagine the anguish of a parent entrusting their child to someone they once loved, only to receive a call that shatters their world. This is the harrowing story of baby Raija, whose brief life was marred by unimaginable pain. On a seemingly ordinary day, her father, Jaden Strait, brought her to the emergency room, her tiny body bearing the marks of severe trauma. Multiple skull fractures, a ruptured spleen, broken ribs, and massive retinal hemorrhaging painted a grim picture. Medical professionals were left questioning, how could such grievous injuries befall an innocent infant? As the investigation unfolded, unsettling details emerged. Jaden, a 17-year-old father, found himself at the center of a storm of suspicion. The community grappled with disbelief and sorrow, seeking answers to the unthinkable. In the ensuing legal battle, Jaden faced charges that would determine his fate and, more importantly, seek justice for Raija. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, responsibility, and the vulnerabilities of the most innocent among us. As we delve into the events leading up to that tragic day, we must ask ourselves, what signs were missed? Could this heart-wrenching outcome have been prevented? And most pressing of all, what would you do if you had even the slightest suspicion your child wasn't safe? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Before we go deeper into the story, we welcome you to our channel, True Crime Zone HQ. Thank you to all our viewers and a special shout out to our subscribers for your continued support. Together, we strive to improve and bring you daily updates on both told and untold true crime stories. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't. In the heart of Des Moines, Iowa, a young mother made a decision she would never be able to take back. Rihanna Anderson was just trying to do the right thing. She wanted her daughter to have both parents in her life. No matter how much had happened between her and her ex, Jaden Strait, she still believed in that. At just 8 months old, Raija Strait was growing, changing, learning the world around her. She had her mother's eyes and a tiny, infectious smile. She didn't know about the fights, the accusations, or the heavy weight of the past that lingered between her parents. She just knew she was loved. But love wasn't enough to protect her. Jaden was only 17 years old, a teenage father with a history of short temper and reckless decisions. Those who knew him said he had moments where he could be thoughtful, even kind. But there were other moments, ones where his anger took control. Rihanna had seen it firsthand. Their relationship had started like any other young love, fast, exciting, full of passion. But as time went on, things changed. The arguments became louder, more frequent, more dangerous. Accusations of cheating, trust broken over and over again. The relationship was no longer about love, it was about survival. By the time Raija was born, Rihanna had already made up her mind. She and Jaden couldn't be together, not in the way she had once imagined. But co-parenting? That was different. Jaden was still Raija's father, and for that reason alone, Rihanna allowed him to remain in their daughter's life. She believed, or at least hoped, that despite everything, he wouldn't hurt their child. But then there was Toni Strait, Jaden's mother. She had been his fiercest protector since childhood. Some would say she was just a mother standing by her son, but others saw something else, a woman who refused to see Jaden's flaws, a mother who covered for him, excused his behavior, and never held him accountable. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain, Jaden Strait was never alone in his choices. And in the middle of it all was Raija, a baby, too young to speak, too fragile to fight back. The events that led to Raija Strait's final moments did not unfold all at once. They stretched across 2 days, each moment bringing her closer to a fate she never could have escaped. On July 12, 2018, Jaden Strait was staying over at Rihanna Anderson's apartment. It wasn't unusual, despite their separation, despite their fights, there were still times when Jaden spent the night. For Raija's sake. But that evening, tensions flared again. Rihanna had seen something on Jaden's phone, messages to other girls. It wasn't the first time she had confronted him about this. It had been the beginning of the end for them months earlier. But now, it was just another argument, another moment of anger and resentment. Words were exchanged. Voices rose. Rihanna was tired. Exhausted. She didn't have the energy for another fight. She had work in the morning. She needed to sleep. Jaden. He was frustrated. Done. He picked up his phone, called his mother, Jaden Strait, and told her to come pick him up. He was leaving. But leaving wasn't the same as letting go. That night, as Rihanna went to bed, she could not have known that her daughter's fate was already set in motion. The next morning, Rihanna woke up early for work. She checked on Raja, who was still asleep beside her. She took in the peaceful moment, kissed her daughter, and started getting ready. Jaden was still there. He hadn't left after all. Maybe that meant something. Maybe it didn't. By 9 a.m., Rihanna was walking out the door. Jaden was watching their daughter. And in Rihanna's mind, Raja was safe. A short time later, Rihanna's father, Arturo Anderson, stopped by the apartment. He wanted to see his granddaughter before heading to work. Raja was awake now, but something seemed off. She was fussy, restless. Maybe she was teething, he thought. Babies have days like that. Arturo held her, walked her around the apartment, trying to soothe her tiny cries. Jaden barely spoke. When Rihanna's father left, Jaden was alone with Raja. And the timeline of the day was just beginning. By 11 a.m., Jaden and his mother, Jaden Strait, were out running errands. Jaden had Raja with him. Security cameras captured a series of stops. A grocery store. A fast food drive-thru. A gas station. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But then, something felt off. At one stop, Tony went inside to buy food. Jaden stayed in the car with Raja. A camera caught him sitting there, staring straight ahead. He wasn't feeding her. He wasn't checking on her. He was just sitting still. What was going through his mind in that moment? Had something already happened? Or was it about to? The footage didn't have sound, but it captured something else, something that would later haunt detectives. Jaden's body language. His stillness. The way he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Was it guilt? Was it frustration? Or had things already spiraled beyond control? At what point did everything change? Did Jaden know, in that moment, that there was no turning back? At 2:24 p.m., surveillance cameras captured Jaden Strait stepping out of his mother's car, cradling his 8-month-old daughter, Raja, in his arms. She was dressed in a tiny onesie, her head resting against his chest as he walked toward the house. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was an image of a father holding his child, a sight that should have been comforting, familiar. But this moment would later become the last time Raja was seen alive. Jaden walked into the house, shutting the door behind him, and for the next several minutes, there was nothing but silence. The house stood still, sealed from the outside world. No sounds, no visible movement, just an ordinary home on an ordinary day. Then, at 2:34 p.m., the front door swung open, and Jaden reappeared, stepping onto the porch. But something was different. He was alone. The baby that had been securely held in his arms minutes earlier was no longer with him. Instead, he let his mother's dog out into the yard, pausing for a moment before heading back inside as if everything was normal. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. At 2:55 p.m., the door opened again. This time, Jaden was carrying Raja once more, but she was no longer the same. Her small body was limp against his chest, her arms hanging loosely at her sides. He stood there for a brief moment, barely moving, barely breathing, before pressing a gentle kiss against her cheek. It was a soft, fleeting gesture, one that could have been mistaken for affection had it not been for the fact that something was clearly wrong. He clutched her a little tighter before carrying her back inside. And then, the door closed once more, sealing whatever had happened inside those walls. Everything had changed. Inside that house, a moment had occurred that no one but Jaden would ever fully understand. At some point during that window of time, Raija had stopped responding. Her tiny body, once full of warmth and movement, had gone still. Whether it was a realization that struck him immediately or a slow, dawning horror, something had made him step outside with her one last time before shutting the door for good. Was it guilt? Panic? Shock? Or had he already accepted what had been done? At 3:30 p.m., Jaden grabbed his phone and dialed his mother, Toni Strait. His voice carried an urgency that was impossible to ignore. "Mom, I don't know what's wrong with my baby." There was no explanation, no clarity, just panic. Toni didn't waste time asking questions. She rushed back home, her mind racing as she sped toward the house. By the time she arrived, Jaden was already standing outside, holding Raija in his arms. She was completely limp. Whatever had happened in that house, whatever had unfolded behind closed doors, the only thing that mattered now was getting to the hospital as fast as possible. Toni grabbed her car keys, and Jaden climbed into the passenger seat, clutching his daughter as they tore down the streets toward Mercy Medical Center. Later, he would tell detectives that he was terrified, that he didn't know what had happened, that one moment his daughter was fine and the next, she wasn't. But the doctors at the hospital knew the truth before a single word had been spoken. The moment the emergency room doors swung open and Raija was rushed inside, they knew what they were dealing with. Jaden handed his daughter over to the medical staff, his hands trembling as they placed her onto the hospital bed. There was a beat of silence as the doctors took their first real look at her. Raija's body was cold, too cold. There was no heartbeat. No breath. But it was when they turned on the examination lights that the full extent of her injuries became horrifyingly clear. Her head was swollen, her tiny limbs marked with bruises, some fresh, some old. The medical team moved quickly, running scans, checking for any signs of life. What they found was devastating. Raija's skull was fractured in multiple places, her ribs were broken, too many to count. She had severe internal bleeding, and her spleen had been ruptured. The damage was catastrophic, irreversible. These weren't the kind of injuries that happened suddenly. This wasn't the result of a simple accident, a fall, or an unnoticed illness. A baby doesn't just stop breathing. Someone did this to her. When the doctors turned back to Jaden, their expressions had changed. The question that followed was direct and deliberate. "What happened to your daughter?" His response was immediate. "I don't know." He insisted that she had been fine earlier in the day, that she had been playing, smiling, breathing. He denied hurting her, denied knowing how she had sustained her injuries. But the medical team wasn't convinced. The kind of trauma Raija had suffered didn't happen in an instant. It wasn't something that could be brushed off or explained away. Someone had done this to her, and the only person with her during those final moments was Jaden Strait. The police were called, and within the hour, Jaden found himself sitting in an interrogation room. He was no longer just a father rushing his daughter to the hospital, no longer just a teenager caught in a tragedy. He was something else now, the only suspect in the death of his own child. Detectives pressed him for details, but Jaden's responses were scattered, vague, and often contradictory. He stumbled over his words, backtracked on his statements, and gave inconsistent answers when asked about the timeline of events. Then, without warning, he asked for a break. He was allowed to step outside, to take a moment to collect himself. But when detectives returned to bring him back in for questioning, Jaden was gone. For several hours, detectives searched for Jaden, but he had seemingly vanished. He hadn't returned home. He wasn't back at the hospital. His mother, Toni Strait, claimed she didn't know where he was. But was that the truth? Or had she been covering for him, giving him time to figure out his next move. By this point, investigators were already beginning to question Tony's involvement. She had been there that day. She had picked Jaden up. She had driven him and Raja around. And when everything went wrong, she had been the first person Jaden called. Had she seen something? Had she known something long before that panicked phone call? The uncertainty surrounding Jaden's disappearance only raised more questions. He had just been questioned about his daughter's death. He had been in a controlled environment, in a hospital, under police watch. And now, suddenly, he was missing. Was this panic? Guilt? Fear? Or had he been waiting for the moment to slip away? While police were searching for Jaden, detectives already shifted their focus elsewhere. They needed to see the place where Raja had spent her final moments. They needed to search Jaden's home. When detectives stepped into the house, the first thing they noticed was the overwhelming mess. Clothes were piled in corners, trash littered the floors, and dirty dishes sat stacked in the sink. It wasn't just disorganized, it was unlivable. And in the middle of it all, sitting near the doorway like a forgotten afterthought, was Raja's car seat. It was still inside, still strapped in place, still waiting for the baby who would never return. The longer detectives searched, the worse it got. In one corner of the room, they found a mattress, filthy, unkempt, covered in stains. It was a place where Raja might have been placed down, a place where she might have spent some of her final hours. And then came the cameras. The house had security cameras mounted in various places, a system designed to capture movement, activity, and provide safety. But when detectives asked for the footage, Tony claimed the cameras weren't working. They were broken, she insisted, unreliable, of no use to the investigation. But was that the truth? Or had the cameras been disabled for a reason? Nothing in that house provided a reasonable explanation for what had happened to Raja. Instead, it only confirmed what everyone already suspected. Someone had hurt her. And whoever had done it was hiding the truth. Detectives already had a list of contradictions in Jaden's story. But as they dug further, the lies kept stacking up. One of the biggest ones came when Jaden told them he had spent the afternoon setting off fireworks in the yard. He claimed that, while Raja was inside napping, he had been outside, lighting fireworks, minding his own business. That, he said, was how he had spent his time. But when police checked the home's surveillance cameras, they found no evidence of it. There were no fireworks. No sounds. No flashes of light. It had never happened. So why had he said it did? Because he needed time unaccounted for. And what happened in those missing minutes was something he could never explain. By now, detectives had pieced together a loose timeline of events, but there was one person they needed to hear from, Raja's mother. Rihanna Anderson had been unaware of everything that had unfolded that day. When she had left her daughter with Jaden, she had trusted him, believed that Raja was safe. Now, she sat in front of investigators, being asked about the very man she had once loved, about the father of her child. And what she told them changed everything. She revealed that Jaden had been rough with Raja before. Not just in a careless way, but in ways that had made her uncomfortable. She had seen how he handled the baby when he was frustrated, the way his patience would wear thin too quickly, the way his grip would tighten just a little too much. She had noticed moments where Raja would cry harder in his arms than she did with anyone else. She had told herself it was nothing, that maybe she was imagining it. But now, looking back, she wasn't so sure. And then, there was Tony. Rihanna spoke about how Tony had always seemed strangely distant when it came to Raja. She had never fully embraced the role of grandmother, never cooed over the baby the way most grandmothers did, never jumped at the chance to hold her, feed her, bond with her. It was as though she had been keeping a certain emotional distance, as though she had already decided something long before anyone else had. But why? Did she know something even back then? Had she seen something and chosen to ignore it? Or worse, had she helped cover it up? These were questions detectives still couldn't answer. But one thing was becoming very clear: Jaden wasn't telling the truth. And Tony? She might have known more than she let on. What do you think? Did Tony Strait know the truth before the police even knocked on her door? Tell us in the comments. As the investigation moved forward, it was time to stop asking questions and start getting answers. Because soon, Jaden Strait would face the consequences of what had happened in that house. With every piece of evidence stacking up against him, Jaden had run out of places to hide. The medical findings, the inconsistencies in his statements, the security footage, it all painted a clear and damning picture. He had been the last person alone with Rija. He had lied about what happened that day. And worst of all, his daughter's injuries proved that what she endured was not an accident. Then came the moment Jaden could no longer avoid. On July 14, 2018, just one day after Rija was pronounced dead, Jaden Strait walked into the Des Moines Police Department and turned himself in. But this was not a dramatic act of redemption or a confession of guilt. He was not there to take responsibility. He was there because he had no choice. The pressure was closing in, the truth was suffocating, and there was nowhere left to run. Detective sat across from him in the interrogation room, watching as he shifted in his chair, his hands clenched together. This time, there were no small talk, no warm introductions. They got straight to the point. Rija is gone, Jaden, one of the detectives said, his voice steady, cold. She's not coming back. Jaden said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the table in front of him. The detectives didn't stop there. They pushed the case in front of him, opened the files, and placed the medical reports on the table. One by one, they laid out the injuries in stark detail. Multiple skull fractures, broken ribs, a ruptured spleen, severe brain bleeding. And then, the final blow, shaken baby syndrome. This wasn't an accident, Jaden, the detective continued. This was a brutal assault. Still, Jaden did not speak. His body tensed, his breathing shallow. He had no explanations left to give. Then came the moment everything changed. The detective leaned in closer, staring directly at him. Tell me, Jaden. When you picked her up that last time, did you already know she was gone? Did you kiss her because you knew it was over? For the first time, Jaden's expression cracked. His jaw tightened, his eyes burned with something unreadable. But still, he said nothing. The silence was louder than words. That was all detectives needed. The weight of Rija's death did not just rest on Jaden's shoulders, it spread throughout the entire community. The horror of the crime had reached beyond just one family, it was a case that shook everyone who heard it. A baby, barely 8 months old, had suffered injuries so severe that medical professionals were left speechless. And now, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, family members, and even strangers who had followed the case closely all gathered to watch as the trial unfolded. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case. They painted a picture of Jaden Strait as an unstable young father who had lost control, someone who lashed out in frustration against his helpless daughter. They presented the medical evidence in painstaking detail, showing how the injuries could not have been caused by a simple fall or accident. The force needed to inflict that kind of damage was unimaginable. This was not carelessness. This was not a mistake. This was intentional. The defense, on the other hand, struggled to shift the narrative. They claimed Jaden had no history of violence, that perhaps the injuries were accidental. They pointed to his age, his inexperience as a father, the stress of being a teenager suddenly thrown into parenthood. But it was all meaningless in the face of the evidence. The security footage. The contradictions in Jaden's statements. The undeniable extent of Rija's injuries. One by one, every argument made by the defense crumbled. The jury watched as doctors took the stand, their testimonies filled with medical certainty. These injuries were the result of repeated force, one doctor explained, his voice unwavering. They are consistent with an infant being violently shaken, slammed, or struck. There is no other possible explanation. The courtroom sat in silence, the weight of those words settling over everyone like a heavy fog. At some point, it became clear, even to Jaden, that this was a battle he could not win. Before the trial could move further, Jaden made a decision that stunned everyone. Rather than face the overwhelming evidence in front of him, rather than sit in the courtroom while more experts dissected every brutal detail of what he had done, he chose to plead guilty. In November 2019, Jaden accepted a plea deal, admitting to second-degree murder and multiple counts of child endangerment. There would be no dramatic final statement, no moment of remorse. Jaden simply took what he knew was coming. He barely reacted as the courtroom listened to the final words before his fate was sealed. The judge, however, did not hold back. "This is one of the most disturbing cases I have ever seen," he said, looking Jaden directly in the eye. "A father's duty is to protect, not destroy. This court will not allow leniency for a crime so vicious, so incomprehensible. A child is gone. And that is something that can never be undone." And with that, the final sentence was delivered. 100 years in prison. A full century behind bars. Jaden did not speak as he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not fight. He did not protest. He simply walked forward, disappearing through the doors, never to live as a free man again. For the family, for those who loved Rijah, there was no victory in this. There was no relief, no real closure. Nothing could bring her back. But at the very least, they knew one thing: the person responsible would never be able to hurt another child again. And now, the world would remember Rijah not as a victim, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes, the most dangerous person in a child's life, is the one who was supposed to love them the most. With Jaden Strait sentenced to 100 years in prison, the legal system had delivered its final judgment. The case was closed. The guilty party was behind bars. But for many, the most haunting question remained unanswered: why? Why did Jaden do it? For investigators, prosecutors, and everyone who followed the case, this was the question that lingered long after the trial had ended. Was it frustration? A fleeting moment of rage? Or was there something even more disturbing beneath the surface? Jaden had never been described as an affectionate father, but up until that day, there had been no formal reports of him harming Rijah. Rihanna had noticed his roughness, the way his patience wore thin too quickly, but she never imagined it would escalate to this. So what had triggered him? Did he know what he was doing? When he carried her out to the front yard at 2:55 p.m., when he kissed her cheek, was that a father saying goodbye to his child because he realized what he had done? Or was it something else? And perhaps the most unnerving question of all, was it really the first time he had hurt her? For Rihanna Anderson, the weight of this loss would never lift. She had left her daughter with her father, believing she would be cared for. She had trusted him. Now, every morning she woke up in a world without Rijah. There would be no first words, no first steps, no laughter filling the room. Just silence. And guilt. Because even though she had no way of knowing, even though she had done what she thought was best, how does a mother ever forgive herself for the one moment she wasn't there? The pain was unimaginable. People whispered about how she must have felt. Some blamed her. How could she not have known? How could she have left Rijah alone with him? Others pitied her, realizing that no amount of punishment for Jaden would ever erase what had been done. For Rihanna, there was only one question that would replay over and over in her mind for the rest of her life: what if? What if she had stayed home that day? What if she had ended things with Jaden sooner? What if she had fought harder to keep him out of Rijah's life? But there were no answers. Just memories. And now, the only thing she could do was live with them. If there was one person in this case who remained an enigma, it was Toni Strait. Throughout the investigation, her actions had raised red flags. She had been present throughout the day's events. She had picked Jaden up. She had taken him and Rijah out. She had been the first person he called when things went wrong. But what did she really know? There were details that didn't add up. Why had she insisted that the security cameras in her house were broken? The footage from outside had worked fine, but conveniently, whatever had happened inside could never be seen. Why had she never asked Jaden tough questions? Why had she rushed to get him instead of calling 911 the moment he said something was wrong with the baby? And the biggest question, had she ever suspected her son was capable of this? Tony had always defended Jaden. She was his protector, his shield. So when he called her, frantic, claiming something was wrong with Rijah, had she known the truth already? Had she already guessed what had really happened? Had she helped him cover something up? Detectives had questioned her repeatedly, but they never found enough to charge her with anything. There was no solid proof that she had been involved in the crime itself. But for the rest of her life, people would always wonder. Had Tony Strait simply been a mother who refused to believe her son was a murderer? Or had she known everything, and chosen to keep it buried? Jaden Strait had been convicted. 100 years behind bars. To the courts, to the law, justice had been delivered. But justice doesn't bring back a child. It doesn't erase the suffering Rijah endured in her final moments. It doesn't take away the pain of a mother who will never hold her baby again. And it doesn't answer the questions that still haunt those who followed this case. Why did Jaden do it? Did Tony know more than she ever admitted? And perhaps the most chilling thought of all, if the cameras had worked that day, if there had been a recording of what happened inside that house, would the truth have been even worse than we can imagine? What do you think? Was justice truly served? Or do you believe there was more to the story? Let us know in the comments. After Jaden was given a 100-year sentence, he never spoke. He never turned to face his family. He never offered an explanation, a moment of remorse, or even a simple apology. He accepted the sentence, just as he had accepted the reality that his life as a free man was over. Even now, locked away behind bars, Jaden has never explained why he did it. Why did he react the way he did on that day? Was it premeditated? A slow build-up of emotions and resentment that finally erupted? Or was it a split-second loss of control that ended in irreversible devastation? Does he feel regret? Shame? Or has he convinced himself of an entirely different version of events, one where he was just an unlucky teenage father caught in the middle of a tragedy? And the biggest question of all, will he ever tell the truth? Some people believe that, over time, guilt finds a way of catching up to even the coldest individuals. That maybe one day, Jaden will sit in his cell, staring at the walls, and finally feel the weight of what he has done. Or maybe he won't. Maybe he will go on, year after year, maintaining the same silence, never giving the answers that so many people have been searching for. But what do you think? Will Jaden ever admit why he did it? Or will the real reason behind Rijah's death remain a mystery forever? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true crime cases like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any future deep dives into cases just like this one. And before you go, if you found this case shocking, you need to watch our next video. I'll see you in the next one.